Next.js has dominated React for years, but for the first time, the crown is actually slipping. There is a new framework in town, and it's doing things Next.js simply can't. And we've all felt the app router fatigue, right? The complex caching, the React server component saga, and TanStack Start promises to fix all of this by bringing back a simpler, more predictable way to build. But is it a Next.js killer or is it just hype? Today, we are putting them head to head across 5 different pillars: routing, Next.js file-based conventions versus TanStack's 100% type-safe navigation. Data fetching, is this the end of use cache? And the beginning of a cleaner way to sync data. The philosophy, server-first approach of Next.js versus the client-power approach of TanStack Start. The backend, how server functions and API routes actually behave when you're building complex logic. And last but the most important, the job market. Should you stick with the industry standard for your resume, or is it time to bet on the next shift? By the end of this, you will know exactly which framework to bet your career on for 2026. So let's see if the future of React is actually a TanStack. So let's start with the philosophy. Let's talk about Next.js first. Next.js is designed around convention over configuration. Its goal is to give you all the bells and whistles needed to spin up your app as fast as possible. It gives you a unified full-stack React experience, strong defaults, a complete ecosystem from routing, data fetching, rendering, deployment, and so on, and a predictable mental model that scales for teams of all sizes. But here's the thing, here's a big difference. Next.js makes these opinions for you, so you can move fast. For example, it has file-based routing system, it has different rendering models, a caching system that's tied to the fetch function in browser, but also the latest cache components feature that allows you to cache things using partial pre-rendering. You get middleware at the edge, and all the deployment is seamless with Vercel, but also has now options to deploy to different cloud providers as well. But the core belief of Next.js is that if we make 100% of the decisions for you, you're going to ship faster and avoid the foot guns. This is why Next.js feels like a framework product rather than a router plus library. It wants to be the default way you build full-stack React applications. What about TanStack Start? TanStack Start is built on a completely different set of values. There is no magic. Everything is explicit or implicit. Everything is TypeScript, fully typed. Composition instead of conventions. It doesn't want to be an all-in-one framework. It wants to be a foundation that you build your app on top of. You build your framework on top of. So what are some key beliefs? TanStack ecosystem, TanStack Start, is in fact built on top of the TanStack router. TanStack router would probably make up to 80 to 90% of what TanStack Start can do. Key philosophy of TanStack Start routing is that routing should be explicit, routes as objects. In fact, even you handle not just routing, but the way you handle data should also be explicit. For example, its loaders that we'll talk about, client-side and server-side state should be managed consistently with access to the TanStack ecosystem. For example, TanStack Query, you could have a powerful synchronous state management library that syncs with your server state automatically just by changing a couple lines. But here's the thing. The developer has full power. There is no magic involved because everything is explicit. There's no automatic React Server Components behavior. In fact, so far, there are no React Server Components to begin with. Although there are some plans to support that in the future, there is no magic fetch caching and there are no hidden boundaries. So the core belief of the framework is that you give developers full control and best primitives and let them build the architecture that they want. This is why TanStack leans heavily on React Router, React Query, and it tries to solve one problem extremely well. Each of these libraries solve the routing problem really well, the caching and state management problem really well, but also forms allow you to build complex forms. There's TanStack DB, and there's so much more in the TanStack ecosystem. So it feels like a framework who dislikes magic and wants predictable behavior. And that's how I would sort of summarize TanStack Start. TanStack Start is a powerful framework that is built on top of Vite. And Vite is essentially the build tooling that allows you to power a really fast server, lightning fast HMR, that is hot module replacement, and it gives you out-of-the-box features, support for TypeScript, JSX, and optimized build thanks to Rollup. Pick the plugins you want on how you want to power your framework. It also has another plugin called as Nitro. If you want to ship full stack Vite apps, so you would be able to add server routes to your application and deploy to many hosting platforms without any fake experience at all. All you need to do is add Nitro as a plugin. TanStack Start as well as Next.js both use file-based routing system. And TanStack Start's router is fully typed. For example, this is an application that we in fact built in the TanStack Start course on this YouTube channel. So definitely take a look at it if you're interested. And for example, if we go to the header component, and now this is where we are linking to home. Now, if I do slash, you're going to see all the different routes that are available inside the application. If I enter a route that does not exist, then it's going to throw an error. It truly believes in TypeScript and the routes are fully typed. It also creates a route tree.gen.ts that allows it to manage what routes exist and so on. This file is automatically generated by the TanStack router. Again, the TanStack router is super powerful. On the other hand, I also have a course on Next.js that is completely free on this channel as well. So definitely take a look. And this is the app we built as part of that. So for example, if we do the same here, go to the hero section and inside the link component, if we type, there is no automatic typing inside of Next.js. In fact, we need to go to the next config file and add type routes equals true. And that is when Next.js can statically type links to prevent typos and other errors. But again, this is an opt-in feature. It's not a default. So a lot of folks might not even know. Versus TanStack Start, it's already built in. It's ready to go. So if you make a mistake, your application just won't work. So Next.js uses the file-based routing system. What this means is you would need to create files and folders in order to route to it, and you need to follow the specific naming convention. What this means is if I want to just create a /admin route, then I could just create a page.tsx inside that. On the other hand, if I want to create a dynamic route, then I would need to create products with a slug, and then I could route to it, and that becomes a dynamic slug route. So I can do /products/ the dynamic ID itself. On the other hand, Next.js also has something called as a layout file. This is the root layout that wraps your entire application. So you would want to add things like header or footer components. At the same time, it has the HTML and body elements as well. You can also set the metadata inside of Next.js by exporting a constant called as metadata. And this lives inside of layout.tsx as well. Similarly, if you want to create dynamic metadata, then you would just need to call the generate metadata function and give it the information it needs to dynamically generate, the title or maybe the description and so on. So that's how you create routes inside of Next.js. On the other hand, the way you would create routes inside of TanStack is also very similar, as in you would have to create a file and folders in order to structure your routes and so on. So the way you would do that is by going to the routes folder inside your source directory. And here you would create a index.tsx route, but that's not all. You would also need to export a route with create file route. For example, if I want to create a completely new route, let's call that route admin, then I just need to create a new file in here called as index.tsx. And as you saw, the minute I created a new file, it automatically created this boilerplate code for me to create a file route, create a component here, expose that specific component. If I want to create a dynamic route inside of TanStack, then again, I need to do something similar. Instead of creating a folder, I would now create admin.id.tsx. And this would mean I would navigate to /admin /$ID. However, if I don't want that, I just want to navigate to ID, then it would just be ID itself. That I don't need to then duplicate the word admin again. This creates a dynamic route inside of TanStack Start. Now, similarly, just like we have layouts inside of Next.js, the layout file inside of TanStack Start would be this specific file _root.tsx as the HTML and body elements. The way you would set the metadata inside of TanStack Start is slightly different. What you would do is you would essentially have this head tag with a metadata array, and here is where you would pass all the information with links, with metadata, and so on. Again, it's very similar. Instead of exporting a constant, you would just expose an array here and then set any sort of metadata information you like. But if you want to add header and footer, this is a perfect spot for it as well, just like you would add in layout. You want to create dynamic metadata, then we can just take a look at the dynamic ID. Inside of create file route, you would have a head tag that will then return the metadata element, an object, an array with different objects such as name, image, and so on, whatever title, description, and so on. This way, this automatically exposes, and this is where you would fetch the data and then export it, for example. Again, we'll talk about loaders in a second, but this is essentially what you would return it. Versus in Next.js, you would just use generate metadata function to export the SEO data for that specific route. So if you notice a difference, in TanStack Start, it's more explicit, more object-based routing. Routes are defined as TypeScript objects, as you can see here. And if I were to navigate to the wrong route, this route exists, but if I were to do something like this, it gives me this squiggly line that automatically tells me that this specific route does not exist. The minute I save, it's automatically fixed it as well, which is awesome. Inside that, you create a metadata array and so on. And that just makes it super explicit exactly what you are updating in your browser. Versus Next.js is going to do that for you with the generate metadata function. So you would get the params, then you would get the data, and then you would set it whatever you like. So if you want to update a description, then you would just update a description and so on. Again, it's more explicit inside our TanStack Start. So far, we have gone over the philosophy, the routing, and now let's talk about data fetching. Now, when it comes to data fetching inside of TanStack Start, there are a few different ways you could fetch data. First of all, TanStack Start uses a concept called as isomorphic loaders, which is extremely important for you to understand. Let's take a look at what that means. It means that those loaders are going to run both on the server as well as on the client, not just on the server. And this is something that might trip you up if you're completely new to TanStack Start. And I covered this in depth in the TanStack Start course, so definitely take a look on this YouTube channel. Now, what this means is every single file route has a specific function called as loader that allows you to load that data. So if that route needs some data, it's going to load it. In this specific function, you could load whatever you want. But remember, this loader is going to run on the server during server-side rendering, but also on client during navigation. So make sure whatever you run here runs both on the server as well as on the client. It might not work if you try to use client-specific APIs on the server. It might throw an error and so on. So this is extremely important. So if we take a look at an example here, if we go to index, then we have a few things going on here in this specific file. We have the create file route that you know how you expose a route inside of TanStack Start. Component will link the component. And then we also have something called as loader that allows you to load this specific data. So now fetch products is not only going to be called on the server, but also on the client. And the way client can access this data is by simply calling route.useLoaderData. So going back, we have isomorphic loaders. But at the same time, you also need to know that TanStack Start is going to use server-side rendering by default. That means it's going to render the HTML for your page on the server versus on the client. But let's say you want a spa-like behavior. You don't want server-side rendering. Then in that case, TanStack Start also offers you a few configurations. For instance, we could now simply go to the read config file. And here we could pass in a variety of different options, such as we could say I want spa as enabled. So I could say I want spa enabled. And this will now turn this entire application into a spa, that is a single page application. But at the same time, if you want to say, I want to pre-render specific routes, you could do that. You could also change it and opt into specific routes to be pre-rendered, specific routes to not be pre-rendered. This specific feature, again, is a configuration inside of the TanStack Start plugin inside of Weed, and you could configure that easily. But here's the thing. Let's say you want these isomorphic loaders, right? But you also want caching, which again, Next.js provides explicitly as well. You could use something like TanStack Query in addition to the loaders so that you not only get server-side loading, that same data available on the client side, but you also get TanStack Query here, so you could cache it simply as well. Then you could feed the product data as initial data to the query. Your query is now going to refetch the data. That query already has the data available. And then you could fetch products, you could cache the data, and so on using TanStack Query. But this is an extremely important pattern here inside of TanStack. At the same time, let's say you want static site generation, there's something called as static server functions inside of TanStack Start. Now, again, this feature is completely experimental, but they are simply server functions that are executed at build time and cached as static assets. So you could have that when you're using pre-rendering or static generation, because they can be set to static mode by applying the static function middleware. But again, this is an opt-in, so you could opt in per route and so on. So if you're thinking about it, I would say like TanStack Start framework is more closely related to how the pages router works inside of Next.js versus the app router works. Because in pages router, we had the full page strategy, right? Like the full static site generation, incremental static regeneration, server-side rendering, and so on inside of Next.js. Versus with TanStack Start, it's something similar, right? Basically opt in for the route entirely, and then you could do more later with it, with TanStack Query and so on. But I would say TanStack Start is more closely related to how Next.js pages router work versus app router. Now, on the other hand, there are 3 different ways to fetch data. One is static site generation that allows you to cache the data for that specific route. Incremental static regeneration, that means you can cache for a specific period and then revalidate that specific data. Or the third one is server-side rendering, which means you don't get any caching. It's going to fetch each and every time, but it's going to load your HTML on the server side. Now, this is with the fetch function. However, with Next.js cache components, for example, it now allows you to cache data. You can mix dynamic data, static data, all in a single route, which gives you the speed of static sites with the flexibility of dynamic rendering. The cache components eliminates the trade-offs by pre-rendering routes into a static HTML shell that's immediately sent to the browser with dynamic content updating the UI as it becomes ready. So you get both. And with cache components, you also get a feature called as partial pre-rendering. With partial pre-rendering, it allows you to provide a static shell, and then as dynamic content is ready, you add a suspense boundary around it, and the dynamic content also becomes available. But all this is available inside of Next.js. In terms of data fetching and caching, you can do a lot inside of Next.js. You get granular caching controls. You have the fetch API if you're fetching external data, and also variety of rendering strategies as well. Partial pre-rendering, static site generation, incremental static regeneration, and server-side rendering. Data fetching and caching inside of Next.js is very powerful. With TanStack Query, as you know, is extremely powerful as well. It allows you to fetch, cache, and synchronize and update your server state in your application. If you've used TanStack Query before, it is extremely powerful. And this is why I feel like TanStack Start is such a really good contender for Next.js, because it has this wide ecosystem with query, with forms, with DB, with TanStack AI, and all of this is fed into TanStack Start, which makes TanStack Start a really powerful framework. So again, all of this, whatever you could do with Next.js in terms of caching, you could also do it with TanStack Query. However, in terms of data fetching models, TanStack is definitely limited. I know you could do incremental static regeneration and so on, but I couldn't necessarily find it in the docs. However, Tanner did comment in one of the tweets that it is possible. So it's coming, the docs will be updated and so on. So you could definitely do static site generation, incremental static regeneration, and server-side rendering inside of TanStack Start as well. However, instead of having granular caching controls and like granular data fetching, you're going to have at a page level basis with loaders, then fed into TanStack Query, and so on. But the fun part is server functions that we'll talk about, which makes it even stronger contender compared to Next.js. But to wrap up data fetching, you can see how with TanStack Start, it's explicit, right? With TanStack Start, we had to explicitly set loaders. Then we had to explicitly use loader data. Then we had to feed it in the query. Like all of this was super explicit. Even with the head tags, right? Like if we go to the head, it's again very explicit. Versus with Next.js, it was a lot more implicit than explicit. And because Next.js is doing a lot for you and gives you all the magic and does a lot. Versus with TanStack Start, it's saying we hate magic. I mean, there will be a little bit of magic, but we also want you to know how that magic works. So it makes it more explicit. overall. Now that data fetching is done, let's talk about server functions inside of TanStack Start. Now, server functions inside of TanStack Start let you define server-only logic that can be called anywhere in your application, such as loaders, components, hooks, or other server functions. Server functions, as the name indicates, literally create an API route. That means it will expose the HTTP endpoint. It is super explicit because server functions, they're not just post calls like we have in Next.js. They are also get calls as well. So let's take a look. For example, we have a create server function here. It says get server time, right? And this specific server function only runs on the server. It returns a new date, and you can call this anywhere you like, such as components, loaders, hooks, and so on. But now, if you want to specify specific HTTP endpoints, you could also do get request, which is the default one. Want to expose a post request, then you would just have to do method post, versus over here, it's implicit, which is method get, because get request is the default. So if you take a look at how we create server functions, this is a server function. It's a dynamic route. And this specific server function is a post call. And it has some input validation here. And then we get the product by ID. We call it inside the loaders here as well. Now, let's take a look at another server function example. We have a form that allows you to create a product. So we have a create product server function. You have the input validator, a create product function, for example, function over here basically inserts it into the database. Then if you take a look, we also have a create server only function. So on the server, it will return a bar, but then on the client, it's going to throw an error. On the other hand, we also have a create client only function as well. So these functions are useful for API access, file system reads, using browser APIs, or so on. If you want to enforce strict environment bound execution, so whether you want a specific function to run on the server and not on the client or vice versa, then you could have something like this too. Server functions in TanStack Start are extremely powerful. If you want to create, update, or delete data, you would use server functions inside of Next.js. But again, there's some magic here. If you want to expose your function as a public HTTP endpoint with a post request, you have to use this use server directive. You can place it at top of the function, or you could place it at top of the file so that every single function inside that file will automatically get exposed as a public HTTP endpoint. So what this means is there's a lot of magic here, and this functionality itself has definitely frustrated a lot of developers because they don't understand that these are not just JavaScript functions now. They have additional magic, and this is syntactic sugar that will expose a HTTP endpoint. There's on top of that, Next.js also has server components. By default, every single page inside of Next.js is a server component. It lets you fetch data and render parts of your UI on the server, and stream it to the client. But if you want interactivity, if you want to use browser APIs, then you would use something called as client components. Now, inside of TanStack, we don't have server components yet. However, there is some support coming up very soon. Keep an eye out for that. Obviously, TanStack has client components because anything that you have in the component will render on the client by default. So with Next.js, you do get automatic React server components behavior. And then if you want to mark something a client component, then you need to add the use client directive. For example, by default, page.tsx, this is the admin page, is in fact a server component. So if happen this is a server component, less JavaScript is going to get shipped to the browser. All of this data is actually rendered on the server. So I'm able to make like API requests here and so on and execute server stuff as well. If I want to mark something a client component, then I could also do that. A lot of my code, in fact, is a server component. When we have a submit page and a product submit form, it's a client component. So inside of Next.js, if you want to fetch data, you would do that in a server component, because by default, every single page inside of Next.js is a server component. But if I want client functionality, I need to make it a client component. There's a lot more magic going on in Next.js with the use server directive, and it took a variety of updates and education and updated documentation to get this right. However, with TanStack, it's actually pretty explicit, right? Like you create a server function, the method is post, there we go. That's it. It's very explicit. Now you know this is going to create a post request, for example, versus if you have a get request, it's going to create a get request, for example, and so on. Now that we have server functions covered, let's talk about middleware. Now, inside of TanStack Start, middleware allows you to customize the behavior of both service routes like get, post, and so on. But middleware is also composable and can also depend on other middlewares. In fact, middleware inside of TanStack Start is, I would say, more powerful and better compared to Next.js. There are two types of middleware. You could either execute it on a per function basis or a per request basis. So what are the kind of things you do with middleware? Authorization, authentication, logging, observability, error handling, and so on. Like I said, it has request middleware as well as server function middleware. And that also ties hand in hand with API routes as well that we'll take a look at. So first of all, if you want to create a middleware, you just do create middleware.server. And then you can also chain your middleware by calling the logging middleware here as well. So for example, we are creating a logger middleware. So we are calling create middleware.server and we are simply logging it. Inside the route, we could pass as a server object a middleware and call a logger middleware over here. This would mean that for every single request, whenever this specific page runs, we are going to call this specific logger middleware. Now, on the other hand, if we want the middleware to also run for server function basis as well, so we could do dot middleware and logger middleware here. So I'm just going to move this under and this needs to be an array as well. So now every time this server function is executed, logger middleware will be called. Anytime this route is being executed, this logger middleware will be called as well. So again, you could have it per function basis, or you could also have it per request basis as well. On the other hand, inside of Next.js, the middleware is in fact called a proxy. So now here I have a clerk middleware. I'm invoking the auth. I'm checking if it has user ID and then performing a bunch of operations and so on and automatically creating their organization and then calling next.response.get. But let's say if I want to add a logger middleware for only specific routes, then I have to do something like if route equals request.route starts with submit, then do, whatever logging or whatever I want here. So all of this will be added to this giant global middleware and I have to filter routes and so on. So it makes it very messy because this specific function is going to run before every single route is called. So now it will have to check that logic, right? If it matches, if the route matches, then run the logger middleware and so on over here. Versus with TanStack Start, I prefer that because you could simply have like this middleware here or this middleware here. So that means this middleware is only going to run here and so on. So this just makes your life a lot simpler. So now we have also talked about middleware. Let's talk about API routes now. Now inside of TanStack Start, we already saw how you would create those API routes, right? We talked about creating server functions with the get method or post method. But there's one more way. Also do server and then have a handler here with a post request. Here you would also have access to request as well. So you could get request.json and then this will expose a post request. And this itself is available as a post route for the specific API. So we have source routes products, right? And this specific products index. So this has a post API here. So if you create a post API request, then it's just going to work with the products API. So TanStack Start not only allows us to create server functions here explicitly just like this, but you could also do something like this if you want. So there are a variety of different options. On the other hand, inside of Next.js, but if you want to create routes inside of Next.js, you could just create a API folder and here you would create a route. So let's call this admin/route.ts. Admin is a API route that's exposed. And here you would simply call like a get request and you would get next response just like this. And then you would create a get API request just like this. Now, the difference between this and calling this exact same functionality in a server component is that here you have options for request and response, for example, which is going to be next request and next response here. This next request and next response is not available inside of server actions. Right? So even if you were to turn this into a post request, you could do that. Now, when it comes to components, Next.js has a variety of components such as the image component inside of Next.js that extends the HTML image element and it allows for automatic image optimization. It also has a link component that extends the anchor element to provide automatic fetching in client-side navigation. It has a script component that allows you to import explicit scripts that you want, and it also optimizes those scripts as well. So it will load a third-party script for multiple routes. It will only load the script once, and even if a user navigates between those routes multiple times. Plus, it also has fonts, which allows you to automatically optimize the font. So that's another component that you have here, wherein you have a fonts API, but it includes built-in hosting for any font file as well. You have access to these Google fonts, and all you need to do is import font from Next Font Google. All these components make Next.js a really powerful library. On the other hand, what TanStack does is TanStack essentially leans on third-party libraries when it comes to image optimization. It recommends using a library called Unpick, which is again a ultimate open source toolkit for deploying for images on the web. When it comes to adding fonts, it asks you to use Font Source, which is a self-hosted open source fonts library that's available on NPM. So what it does is it essentially is recommending all these open source amazing third-party libraries instead of using framework components when it comes to optimization. Similarly, when it comes to using script, it does have a script component. So if we go to route, it does have these scripts component that essentially render body script tags from different routes as well. And TanStack Start also has a link component when it comes to linking between routes. We have this link component, which also has prefetching. So you could link between different routes as well. So as the user is about to enter their specific viewport, it's going to prefetch their specific route as well. Now to enable it, you would need to essentially add default preload as intent to preload all the links as well if you like. So again, TanStack has link component. TanStack leans on third-party libraries instead of framework components for the same functionality. So Next.js gives you out of the box, versus TanStack tells you exactly how to achieve it. So with Next.js, it has optimized utilities and more integrated ecosystem, versus TanStack Start, it gives you more freedom to choose those utilities and however you want to configure your application. So when it comes to deployment, you could pretty much deploy your TanStack Start application wherever you like. It's not tied to any specific provider. With TanStack Start, it's a completely open source framework, right? So it's designed to work with any hosting provider, for example. So the official hosting partners are in fact Cloudflare or Netlify. However, you can deploy to Cloudflare Workers, Vercel, Nitro, Netlify, Railway, Node Server, Bun, AppWrite sites, and so on. And there is some documentation here for each of these. At the same time, if you want to deploy Next.js for the longest time was optimized for Vercel deployment, but recently there have been some updates that you could deploy Next.js elsewhere as well. So for example, it gives you more explicit information here with more templates, but also there are a variety of different adapters here that you could use as well for Next.js. However, you could still deploy elsewhere, but with Vercel, it's a lot simpler with Next.js, which is also why for the longest time, it was in a lot of controversy as well. What I love about Next.js is the whole React server components, cache components, and server functions model. It truly allows you to ship less JavaScript to the browser. Now, I know TanStack Start is going to have support for React server components, but this is what exists today inside of Next.js. It also enables you to create smaller components with Next.js because of the way you architect your application and how it enforces you to do so that your client components are in the leaf nodes and you can make them interact. If you have a highly interactive application, you might not make as much use of it as if it was not so interactive. But from a lot of applications, there's not a lot of interactivity. So in that case, it's a great model. Plus, on top of that, with cache components, it again allows you to make things simply cacheable by adding a use cache director. And I am in love with it. I wish there was better logging if there was like a logger that Next.js could add so that we know if things were cached or not, like more of a debug system or some sort of dev tools for that. But overall, I'm a fan. The docs of Next.js are also amazing. They document exactly how the framework works, and you can simply go to the docs to figure out your use cases and write code. So kudos to the Next.js team for that. On the other hand, what I really love about TanStack Start is how explicit everything is, especially the server functions API. With server functions, you could simply just create a function, create server function, add a method, get or post, and that explicitly tells you exactly what that function does. You don't have to guess that. The fact that you just add method get or method post, it makes it explicit. With Next.js, with server actions, it's very confusing with use server directive. I have gotten used to it, but I know as I'm teaching Next.js, I have a course on Next.js, and on this YouTube channel as well, I know it is a bit challenging to explain to others and how easy it is to make mistakes, because when you're shipping a lot of code, I think the framework should help you from making mistakes. And I feel like with server functions, there needs to be more that we could do on the Next.js side to improve server actions overall. For example, throw an error if a server action is not protected or something like that as well, so that folks know that, hey, this actually exposes an HTTP endpoint, or if a certain server action code has been exposed, and so on. I know there has been a lot of updates there, but still, I feel like there could be a little bit more. On the TanStack side, after shipping one production application with TanStack Start, I found that the error logging could definitely be improved. The fact that loaders run on this client as well as on the server can definitely trip folks out, because if they run on the client as well as on the server, plus there are server functions that we could create as well. There's a lot of server stuff and there's a lot of client stuff, and I think if the boundary between server and client components could be better improved with more error logging, with more logging in general, would really help, because I found that the interactivity of your application just simply stops working if you were to call server-side code on the client side that's not meant to run that way. But on the consoles, there was no logging whatsoever. Now, I know TanStack Start is still being worked on. There is a release candidate, but that does not mean that there won't be improvements or bugs as we use the framework. But it's in the RC stage. So I know that's the case, but this is definitely something that the framework could improve upon. The other thing I also found was the documentation could be improved as well. For example, I've seen folks on Twitter say that TanStack Start does offer static site generation, incremental static regeneration, and server-side rendering. Now, server-side rendering is the default, so it's definitely obvious. But the other two, I feel like if there were more examples in the docs for how you could achieve that, it would lead to more adoption as folks from Next.js try to migrate to TanStack Start. Overall, I'm a huge fan of TanStack Start, and I truly believe in its future, and it's going to be a really solid competitor to Next.js. In fact, if you have a lot of client interactivity, and if you want an application that not only focuses on the server, but is also heavily focused on the client, then definitely TanStack Start is a strong contender. If you want to ship less JavaScript to the browser, you want the capabilities of React server components and have caching capabilities built in with a lot of different powerful components from the framework itself, such as the image component, font, script, and so on, then definitely Next.js is a solid contender. Now let's talk about the most interesting and the most important topic that you've been waiting for, the job market. Now, I've been receiving this question quite a bit. Is it worth it? Is it worth it to invest in TanStack Start, considering, Next.js is dominant in the job market? What do you foresee in 2026? Well, first of all, I think that definitely Next.js dominates the current job market with thousands of open positions globally, while TanStack Start is too new right now to have significant dedicated job listings. However, the broader TanStack ecosystem, such as TanStack Query, TanStack Router, appears in many job descriptions, more specifically in TanStack Query. Next.js job description definitely has a lot of presence with 5,000 dedicated job listings on LinkedIn, Indeed. It featured in maybe 30 to 40% of React developer job descriptions as well. It's commonly listed as a required skill for many job descriptions as well, and it's often paired with some sort of a cloud deployment pair, for example, Vercel deployment or something like that. But it's very strong when it comes to deploying static sites, for instance, or like well-funded startups. When it comes to TanStack Start job market, you can already see the number of NPM downloads going up, the GitHub stars, contributors, and so on. If you take a look at the ecosystem, TanStack Query, right, like NPM downloads here is just insane. So the broader TanStack ecosystem appears in 15 to 20% of React's job listing. TanStack Query is the most requested library from every ecosystem. In fact, for one of the jobs we were definitely looking for, if you have TanStack Query experience. It was not something that was a must, but definitely when I was hiring, I was looking for that too. But I am seeing early adoption in smaller companies and startups. TanStack Start has started to appear like often in a nice to have phase rather than a requirement phase. But here's what I truly think. What I think is that TanStack ecosystem overall is massive. It's high quality open source software. It's been the ecosystem along with Start, Router, Query, Table, and so on is used by a lot of different companies already. So it's just a matter of time that TanStack Start will start to show its dominance, I should say, and more companies are going to adopt it. So I do think in 2026, TanStack Start, the future of the entire ecosystem, but more specifically TanStack Start, is looking really bright because of the trust on the creator like Tanner Linsley and the variety of different libraries that he has created. I also have an interview on my channel that interviewed Tanner on TanStack and the ecosystem and so on. So definitely take a look if you're interested. But I feel like TanStack Start is the framework you should learn because more and more jobs will start popping up and you will be able to stand out with it. Plus, on top of that, there are a variety of skills that easily transfer. React fundamentals transfer between the frameworks, TypeScript proficiency, vital for both, but especially for TanStack because if you don't understand TypeScript well, you might struggle a little bit with TanStack. The client and server architecture understanding shows that you have full stack experience, API integration experience, as well as state management concepts with TanStack Query. All of these are skills that easily transfer. So Next.js will continue to dominate the market through 2026 for sure. TanStack Start adoption is growing, and I do feel like it will start to dominate in 2026. Companies that already use TanStack Query will more likely adopt TanStack Start because it's easier. Developers who don't like the bells and whistles and who don't like a lot of magic done for them, they are going to opt for something like TanStack Start. So I would say the knowledge of both of these frameworks are increasingly valuable. I would not say one is winning over the other because both are extremely powerful. I would say though, looking for jobs in the next 6 months, go for Next.js because obviously Next.js is already dominant. Having said that, thank you so much for watching. As next steps, check out the TanStack Start course on my channel that allows you to build and deploy a production ready app, or you could check out the Next.js course on my channel, which also lets you build and deploy an e-commerce application. If you go with either of these, it's an amazing choice. Or go both of these and learn and level up your Next.js skills and be ready for 2026. All right, thanks for watching. Bye for now.